Добрый день, коллеги.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. We're just on time, and I'm glad to see that there are so many people in the hall in the end of the Congress. And first, I would like to introduce the participants of our discussion. First, Gabriel De Bella, resident representative of IMF office in Russian Federation, was the leading economist of the Fund for the United States. Hakan Kara, chief economist of the Central Bank of Turkey, previously headed the Department of Economic Modeling of Turkey and the Department of Research. Oscar Arce, General Director for Economics and Research of the Department of Economics and Statistics of the Bank of Spain. Previously was the Director of the Economic Analysis.
What was your bank? Lakaya, Lakaisa? How should I pronounce it?
Of Lakaisa Bank, the third largest bank on the assets volume in Spain. Then Nikolai Korzeniewski, financial analyst, a teacher of the Graduate School of Economics, and Sergei Slobodyan, the director of Economics Department of the Graduate School of Economics in St. Petersburg, the associate professor of research of Prague University, and head of applied economics program. So thank you very much, dear colleagues, for joining in. My name is Igor Dmitriev, and I head the Monetary Policy Department of the Bank of Russia. And our today's topic is about 4%. That's our favorite figure. And yesterday we had quite informing sessions on inflation and growth, and today we will discuss the next day. And we'll discuss the issues on the formation of target. That's part of our discussion in the preparation of the main preparation of our policy for the next 3 years, and I hope that today's discussion will allow us to answer certain questions. And shortly, what I would like to ask you to discuss. Now we see the end of the first stage, and after the shift to inflation targeting, we're close to the goal, and it's glad that 4.4 figure causes so many discussions about shock, about surprise, and so on. Yet I was the participant of these discussions. And here our next stage is the necessity to retain inflation at this figure so that we would have financial stability, so that we wouldn't think that it was sheer luck or just excessively strict policy. And to some extent, this stage may be a more difficult one than the previous one. And it would be interesting to learn the experience of other countries. And now we see that the susceptibility of inflation is reducing to shocks, and now we see that there is less reaction. And there's a need for for smaller reaction from the central bank, and we are also be discussing the anchoring of expectations. This is the process that requires not only direct instruments, rates, normatives, but also active communication policy. And here it is important to stick to the main principle of targeting, to tell what you are doing, and to do what you are telling. So there are certain shocks of indirect impact for the Bank of Russia. That's the food price volatility, and there's quite a lot of food products in consumer basket, the instability in the markets, tariff and tax policy issues, and also some complicated problems that are harder to identify, some structural problems that can aggravate the certain shock factors, and they're quite well known. So that's lack of competition, low mobility of resources, and all in all, yet the economy adapted to external shocks, but still it is rather inflexible. And once again, this discussion is the continuation of the discussion to the preparation of major fields in the next 3 years of the approaches to target setting. How should central bank formulate the target? How should it reach it? What will be in the focus of decision making at this new stage of provision of long-term price stability? And what format do I offer? We will have one round of reports, 10-15 minutes. Dear colleagues, please stick to time. And then when we have time, we'll have time for questions to each other. We don't have the round table, but maybe we will imagine that it is a round table and you may ask questions to each other. I mean, our speakers and maybe the audience may ask questions. So that's nearly it, what I wanted to tell you before we start. And first, I would like to give the floor to Nikolai Korzeniewski. So you wrote about the importance of taking into account structural factors for countries that were already participant or already successful in targeting. And I'm very interested to know your point of view from the outside. We are the representative of official sector, excluding the academia represented by Sergei. But you, how do you see this problem? So you have the floor, Nikolai. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation, and it's quite a responsibility to start this discussion in such a panel. And I would like, as I'm an outsider, I would like to outline a few points that are always present both in discussions from the outside in less professional discussions and in some economic things like general practical things regarding monetary policy. So please, can I have the presentation? I think that was already voiced on this forum. That's external conditions. And an interesting thought that was voiced was that actually what happens in many countries from the point of view of unified pattern, well, this, it resembles, they resemble each other. We are all developing countries that have their own shocks, their own explanations, and their own transmission channels and the influence of global factors, but yet we have a single unified observation that is covering both developed and developing countries. That's a drop of potential output and the drop of the natural rate. And our economic community and non-economic community are used to the fact that we saw the reduction of the economic output, the potential one, and it happened before 2013, 2014, before all the political problems, and it happened according to the general consensus in 2012, 2013, and no one was talking that that automatically provides for a lower inflation regime level. And the central bank was one of the few institutions that considered it at once, recognized it, and fought with private sector. Because private sector used to denounce the fact that we'll have 4% inflation, considering the shock, considering the crisis of balance of payments. So private sector denounced the opportunity of such a situation. But if we take a global look, well, there are exclusions. But anyway, the general picture is the following one. Nearly in all the economies, we saw the drop of potential output at the natural rate level. And there are many unifying characteristics. For example, a good labor market, considering this overall picture. It is explained by demographic factors and other rational factors, but the thing is that no matter how you explain, the inflation is high, or we don't have inflation when there is a good labor market, and that's a new thing that the economists will need to take into account. We can consider theories of circular stagnation and many others, and they resemble our situation as well, because we also have a lack of investment when we have excessive savings. But the only thing is that now we can declare that we are making, we're doing it for purpose. And Russia, regardless of the unique interaction with foreign countries, history is undergoing through the same processes that nearly all economies have underwent. We started with a different position and ending in a different position, but anyway. And yet another thing that I wanted to point out, the assessment that the president of the Bank of Russia is constantly referring to, the potential pace of growth is estimated as 1.22%, and long-term natural rate at the level of 3%, and that's rather a strange disposition because according to the methodologies of support, methodologies of assessment, this rate should be lower. But the Bank of Russia wrote that maybe our equilibrium rate is 1%, but this figure is less frequently voiced in public. And the figure that I start thinking about it, and there's no doubt that that is a correct assessment, and that the central bank understands their essence, but the fact what was chosen as a publicly voiced figures like 1.22% and 3% for long-term natural rate, maybe it is a kind of detection of the preferences of the Bank of Russia and the lack of desire of the Bank of Russia to avoid the inflation here. And recently you had the forecast of the Ministry of Economy that said that the inflation can be from 3.2%, but considering the global trends and the disinflation level, it was clear that a large-scale devaluation took place and everything is clear, but the pace of dropping the prices resembles burning mad investors. He said what they wanted to hear, and they didn't sort everything out, so 3.2% for inflation, but we should look into details, and I think that that's a sphere for tangible research. And talking about technical issues, here we can mention two things. And the first thing is that we have quite a share of food products in our basket, 38%. If we consider the Russian basket, and we are in a specific group of countries in the structure of consumer price index at the beginning of inflation targeting, like Serbia, Armenia, and the Philippines. And Armenia is quite an experienced targeter, strange as it is, but the Philippines have a very interesting experience. They decided to change the key rate depending on what happens in the external market. But maybe their experience is not suitable for Russia fully, but whether we want it or not, we will have deviations from the target, and I think that we need some elementary mathematics to count down everything, because you get this prices 2% from target, and you need to understand how to communicate it properly. And yet another thing, as the governor mentioned, there were definitions like average inflation can be can demonstrate a lot of things here, but yes, it's a good source for defining inflation. But if we provide that there is certain possibility of shifting to a different regime, maybe we should ask a question: is this information enough? Yes, inflationary expectations were not implemented without the inflation getting to the target, but considering the monetary policy, we have yet another adequate indicator, the market expectations for inflation, and unfortunately we have only one such instrument by now, issued in 2015, and de facto it's 3 years old by now. And then as the central bank coordinates its efforts with the Ministry of Finance, maybe they can prepare more information on that, because for Ministry of Finance they have the deficit of budget, and if we'll have a number of such products and private sector will study them and new investors arise, I think that it would be an adequate measure of inflationary expectations in Russia, and this measure is not enough now. And the last thing that I wanted to mention, not to take more time, is that, well, in my mind I'm very much afraid of this high sacrifice ratio. For example, the September of 2008, the rate of 2%, and Ben Bernanke did not reduce it. The Lehman Brothers collapse took place recently, and the monetary policy was not changed. Yes, it's clear that before that it was a reduction to level of 2%, but after that the mitigation didn't follow, and after that we learned from the protocols that the inflation in the last 12 months was higher than 2% target of the Federal Reserve, and as the previous inflation was higher, the decision was taken not to do anything. And inflation expectations of 5 years was 1.23 then. And so I think that that's for economists. We need to find this balance between inflation that is looking forward and the inflation of the past. So that's it. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nikolai. You've heard my urge to expand the number of questions that I wanted to discuss, and now I would like to give the floor to Oscar. So, Oscar, you had a topic studying of synergies of the policies inside the European Union and their reaction to the shocks, considering the inflation targeting conditions and the experience of the Euro Central Bank of slow convergence and even divergence of policies. It would be very interesting to listen to the Euro Central Bank experience from the point of view of Spanish experience, maybe some lessons for Russia that you can draw. Maybe you can advise us something getting out of this stage, and what policies should be paid attention to, what coordination policies at the next stage of reaching price stability.
Thank you very much, Igor. Let me first thank Bank of Russia for inviting me and for putting me in the program. Actually, this is the very last slide. Can we go back? Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I have chosen essentially three sets of questions. I will talk initially about some facts and recent experience on the monetary policy of the European Central Bank. Then I will devote a couple of minutes to the experience of the Spanish economy within the euro. I think there are some interesting experience to be shared with this audience, and some of the problems that we face in the past and that we are still facing may be of some interest for the Russian policy debate. The ECB is an inflation targeter, although it's not explicitly recognized in its mandate. I mean, at the end of the day, the mandate of the ECB is one which is fully consistent with an inflation target. In this particular case, the inflation target is defined as an inflation rate measured by the HICP that is below but close to 2% over the medium run. The main instruments of the ECB to fulfill this mandate before the crisis were the three short-term nominal interest rates. An important element were the so-called overnight facilities, including the marginal deposit facility and the marginal lending facility, which gave rise to a corridor over which the interbank market rate would typically lie within this corridor. And the main policy rate was the main refinancing operation that currently is implemented through auctions that have 7 days of maturity. Before the crisis, the ECB was very successful in delivering on its goal. The average inflation rate between 1999, which was the date of the inception of the euro, and the end of 2007, just before the crisis, was 1.92%, which is certainly close to 2%. Okay, so before the crisis, it did pretty well in terms of the mandate. There were some positive shocks on inflation in 2008, as you can see in this figure, but they were mainly related to some shocks on oil prices. However, from 2013 onwards, as you can see on the right part of this picture, inflation has been persistently below 2%, but not so close to 2%. Actually, inflation these days is around 1.3% in the euro area, which is well below the target. And also inflation expectations are stuck at levels that are not consistent with the mandate. The last figures published by the ECB staff in June this year essentially said that inflation expectations for the end of 2019 were at 1.6%. That is well below the 2% target. So, and this is so in spite of the fact that the ECB has moved its interest rates quite aggressively following the first signals of low inflation and deflationary pressures. As you can see here, the ECB reacted quite aggressively to the first signals of low inflation, and now most of its rates are very much close to zero. Indeed, the deposit facility rate is below zero, is at minus 0.4%. The lending facility rate stands at 0.25%, and the main rate, the main refinancing operations rate, stands at 0%. So in a sense, the ECB is already at its effective lower bound. In this situation, the ECB has tried to provide more monetary stimulus by adopting a number of non-standard measures. An important first step was taken in 2012 following the famous statement by President Draghi when he said that he would do whatever it takes to facilitate a smooth functioning of the euro area. And this program essentially consists of a conditional commitment by the European Central Bank to purchase government bonds in case of liquidity crisis. Also, the ECB has implemented a number of long-term refinancing operations. These are liquidity injections for the banking sector at very competitive interest rates and over a long maturity period. And these operations have been very effective in providing banks in the euro area with long-term financing at very competitive conditions at a time at which the interbank market essentially did not work properly. Perhaps the most important piece of the battery of non-conventional measures adopted by the ECB was its quantitative easing program, the so-called asset purchase program, according to which the ECB is buying, and this is still running, is buying both private assets and public debt at the current pace of 60 billion euros per month. And also the ECB has made quite an intense use of forward guidance announcements, along which the Governing Council of the ECB commits to keep interest rates at levels that are relatively low. Well, the effect of all these policies has been quite visible in terms of the size of the ECB balance sheet. As you can see on the left panel, at this moment, the size of the ECB balance sheet is more or less 40% of the total GDP of the euro area, which is significantly larger than that of the Bank of England or that of the US Federal Reserve. Japan is a completely different story. It's the yellow line there, whose scale is on the right. Okay, so in the case of Japan, the balance sheet of the Bank of Japan is now something around 100% of GDP. But still, the ECB is taking a huge part by and taking some risk by increasing its balance sheet in a very sensible manner. So what are the effects of all these measures to fight low inflation? Well, as you can see here on the left panel, following the announcement of all this battery of measures, including negative rates, long-term financing operations, and QE in 2014, we have seen a significant reduction in the key interest rates of that the banks in the euro area set on their loans. So you can see there that the interest rate significantly decreased following the announcement of all these measures. On the right panel, you see that the spreads on sovereign debt bonds, especially those of the periphery countries like Spain and Italy, also eased significantly following the announcement of the outright monetary operations of the ECB. So all in all these measures have been quite effective in normalizing the functioning of the financial markets in the euro area. And in terms of the macroeconomic impact, I'm showing here some estimates made by some colleagues of mine at the Bank of Spain. We try to calculate the impact of all these measures on both GDP and inflation. And essentially what we find here, I mean, these figures have to be interpreted with some caution, but what we find here is that over the last 2 years, in accumulated terms, all these non-conventional measures by the ECB would have increased GDP by something around 1.7 percentage points. And for the case of inflation, the accumulated impact between 2015 and 2017 would be something around 1.5%. So this implies, looking at the right figure for inflation, this implies that in the absence of all these measures, the euro area would have had most of the last 2 years would have suffered a negative level of inflation. So in this sense, all these measures, according to these estimates, have been quite successful. Still, inflation expectations for the euro area remain relatively subdued. Here you have the forecast of the euro of the ECB for GDP and inflation, and also the forecast coming from the IMF, which is the dark blue line there. I mean, if you look at inflation on the right panel, both the ECB and the IMF are forecasting levels of inflation for the euro area that fall below 2%, well below 2%. And the IMF, which has a longer horizon of projections until 2022, basically expects that inflation will only come back to 2% on a very, very gradual manner. So this implies that, according to this forecast, which I think are more or less in line with the consensus, inflation in the euro area will not come back to levels close to the target until a few years. And this essentially tells something about the difficulties to escape a situation in which the central bank has already been constrained by the effective lower bound, an issue that I will discuss later on with more detail. So let me say a few words on Spain. Before the euro, before '99, we did quite a huge effort in reducing debt, fiscal deficits, and so on, in order to fulfill the criteria to join the euro. But once in the euro area, I mean, especially in the first decade of the euro, before the crisis, my home country experienced a huge loss of competitiveness. I mean, as you can see on the left panel, the relative unit labor cost of the Spanish economy vis-a-vis those of the euro area deteriorated very rapidly before the crisis as a result of a combination of a rapid increase in wages, in the compensation per employee, and falling productivity. In parallel, we ran a positive differential of inflation before the crisis with respect to the euro area. So this loss of competitiveness essentially came hand in hand, and I think this is also an important lesson for a monetary union or for a large country like Russia that shares the same currency for very different, potentially very different economic regions. We faced also an important accumulation of financial imbalances before the crisis. Actually, many of you may know about this. We suffered a huge bubble in the real estate sector that came hand in hand with a rapid growth in private credit. At the same time, we ran a huge current account deficit that in 2007 reached something around 10% of GDP. And this happened in a situation in which inflation was higher than in the rest of the euro area, but was relatively low, 3%, 4% at most. And GDP was growing at a very decent figures, like 3%, 4%. So this is an important first lesson. I mean, inflation targeting and stable and low inflation is not a guarantee of macroeconomic stability, and it's not a guarantee of financial stability. So let me skip this. Let me just say something about the depth and intensity of the crisis. If you look at the left panel here, the red line is the GDP, real GDP in Spain. This quarter, the second quarter of 2017, is, according to our estimates, we would have recovered the level of real GDP that was produced in our economy before the crisis. So it has taken almost 1 decade to recover the level of GDP that we observed before the crisis. So this tells you about the intensity of the crisis in this country. So some potentially useful lessons of our experience in the euro. As I said before, an inflation-oriented monetary policy in the context of an insufficient economic union is not a sufficient condition to guarantee financial stability. Financial imbalances may emerge even in a context of stable inflation and positive GDP growth. The lack of a macroprudential framework with a focus on systemic risk limited the ability of supervisory authorities and governments to control the build-up of financial imbalances before the crisis. And not only this preventive arm did not work properly, but also our capacity to manage the crisis at the level of the euro area was very limited. And in fact, during some years, in particular between 2010 and 2012, we suffered the so-called bank sovereign diabolic loop, along which risk in the sovereign sector feed back onto higher levels of risk into the financial sector, and we find ourselves without suitable tools to put this diabolic loop to an end. Some important steps have been taken since 2012. I mentioned before the outright monetary transactions program introduced by the ECB, but also some positive steps have been taken in terms of setting up a banking union through the introduction of the so-called single supervision mechanism and a single resolution mechanism. Also, there has been some important some changes in the European economic governance system, and the European semester is a very important element now to anchor fiscal policies at the level of the euro area and to coordinate the implementation and to steer for the implementation of structural reforms. However, the monetary union is not still a complete economic union, and there are some areas in which much work is still to be done. One is the need of completing the banking union. For instance, we lack a common deposit insurance scheme. We need to foster the capital market union. I mean, some timid steps have already taken by the European Commission to provide some ideas and some initiatives, but so far the progress here is very limited, and the same can be said with respect to the fiscal union. We have a monetary union without common fiscal backstops, and this creates problems at times of crisis. So let me just finish with some remarks about inflation targeting that may be of some interest in light of the current discussion in Russia. So inflation targeting is effective to deliver low and stable inflation. I think there is little doubt on this based on the experience of the euro area. But as said before, it's not sufficient to provide macro-financial stability. Structural reforms are key to improve the economic efficiency and the resilience of the economy. In Spain, we forgot that before the crisis, and the depth of the crisis essentially reflects the lack of political willingness to implement structural reforms. If you want to be credible with inflation, you have to be credible with fiscal policy as well. And again, in the euro area, in some countries of the euro area, we suffered very much during the crisis because the levels of public debt were at some point perceived as not being sustainable. And as said before, a macroprudential framework is absolutely necessary to address financial imbalances and systemic risk. An important issue here, and I was quite surprised of seeing, listening to Sergei's about the discussion on the natural interest rate in Russia. I'm a little bit surprised of the low figure that you mentioned before, the 1% figure. Inflation targeting strategies seem to be very asymmetric, in the sense that inflation targeting has proved very effective to reduce inflation, but now it seems that it's not that effective in producing higher, in producing rises in the inflation rate. Okay, once you are below the target, I think that the difficulties faced by some of the major central banks in the world, including not just the ECB, but also the Federal Reserve, the Bank of Japan, in achieving their goals, testifies to this. It's very difficult once you are well below the target, and once you are stuck at the 0 lower bound. The experience, the recent and the current experience, is telling us that it's very difficult to convince people that you can deliver on your target. Okay, so this is an important lesson that may be of some help here in other countries as well. And there are some interesting discussions these days about the optimal level of the inflation target. Some people, as the former chief economist of the IMF, Olivier Blanchard, argued that it should be the current levels of inflation targets in some countries should be rethought, and in particular should be raised in order to give central banks more policy room in case of negative shocks. I think this is an unsettled question, but it's a very interesting one, in which there are many non-trivial trade-offs here. Some people are calling for the potential implementation of strategies not just based on inflation targeted, but based on price level targeting. And here again, there are some pros and cons in comparison with inflation targeting. And in some advanced economies, there is now a very recent debate about the role not just of interest rates in conducting monetary policy, but also about the role of the central bank balance sheet. I don't know whether this is a relevant issue for Russia, but certainly is one issue that is attracting more and more attention. I will stop here. Thank you.
Спасибо большое, Оскар. Много интересных.
Thank you very much, Oscar. Very many interesting new ideas and thoughts you have thrown in. So the ECB, for most of us, was a paragon in inflation targeting process, with its numerous tools and approaches which were taken on board and studied in Russia. So I'm inviting Gabriel as the next presenter to look through the international experience prism and your academic background, so that we could better understand what faces us at the following stages. What are your thoughts and ideas about the situation in Russia? And picking up on what previous presenter said, we're not disputing the 4%, which is taken as a constant for Russia in the years to come, but the price level targeting or index-based approach, the horizon, this kind of sliding horizon of 12 months and other things, if you could cover them in your presentation as well.
Спасибо большое, Igor. Of course, I speak terribly Russian, so I'm going to do the presentation in English. First of all, thank you for the invitation again. I'll try to go fast. I have some slides to support the presentation. First of all, let me begin with an almost redundant slide defining what inflation targeting is, and I'm just referring to Svensson, that is like the guy in inflation targeting. So basically, all these elements you should know already about, because Central Bank of Russia has been implementing inflation targeting already since 2014. So first, numerical target, although this numerical target is never strict. I mean, the central bank not only cares about inflation, but also cares about the output gap. But in general, the main issue is to reach this inflation target. Second thing is that it's very important, the forecasts. I mean, when the central bank establishes its policy, thinking about forecasts and inflation conditional on a forecast interest rate path. So forecasts and having adequate modeling, very important. Third issue, extremely important. Central bank has to be extremely transparent. Communication has to be very clear, so in order not to confuse markets. And the central bank needs to be independent and accountable, otherwise it's very difficult to implement a policy. But one thing that is usually lost sometimes in translation or when people just refers to the usual textbooks on inflation targeting is that when one thinks of inflation targeting, thinks about euro area, thinks about maybe the US, these countries, I mean, the first element that they think about when they talk about inflation targeting is that there is a trade-off between activity and inflation. And so the output gap is positive, inflation is high, the central bank tightens monetary policy, the opposite happens when the output gap is negative, this is very clear. But the question is that for emerging markets, and Russia is one, and for research-rich countries, Russia is one, there are other elements, and so inflation targeting becomes much more complicated. One, just as a footnote, if you're interested, we produced some research in the context of the last Article 4, and this first part, economic cycle and inflation through a Phillips curve, actually exists in Russia, and actually this relationship is stronger during moments in which activity is higher. But the other two things that I want to point out is that actually in research-rich countries, all rich countries like Russia, changes in relative prices are also a possible source of inflation, in particular if fiscal policy is not well anchored. And second, in an open economy like Russia, open to capital and financial accounts, movements in the financial account of the balance of payments can produce fast changes in the exchange rate, and clearly there is a very strong link between exchange rate and inflation, so changes in risk perceptions creates changes in exchange rates, and this can also produce some noise in inflation. These elements need to be taken into consideration. So just in order to put a little bit of this framework into place, Russia is an open economy. So, for instance, in establishing an inflation target, establishing an interest rate policy, we'll have to take into consideration the external interest rates. Expected changes in the real exchange rate that we're going to talk about a little bit later is deeply and intimately related with fiscal policy and changes in risk. But most important thing is that this real interest rate, that natural real interest rate that my colleagues were talking about before, is not something static, but it changes through time, and it changes through time, sometimes responding to shocks, and sometimes responding to policy. So better policies can actually influence the level of the natural rate, and so it influences the level of the nominal interest rate or the policy rate of the central bank. So this is exactly what I try to say in this slide. Basically, if I have a fiscal policy that is not anchored, and Russia, just think about Russia, the fact that 50% or almost 50% of the revenues in the federal budget are linked with the production of oil and gas. Automatically, if fiscal policy is not well anchored, if there is an increase in oil prices, the economy is going to be perceived as less risky. If there is an increase in the surplus, the economy is going to be perceived as less risky. But if there is not a well-anchored fiscal policy is going to be pro-cyclical. And if it's pro-cyclical, then when there is terms of trade that is positive, inflation is going to increase, but the real exchange rate is going to appreciate. And when there's a negative terms of trade shock, and this is the typical example at the end of 2014, what's going to happen is that the government will have to adjust the fiscal position, and in the context of a floating exchange rate, this is going to result in a large depreciation of the exchange rate, and following that, a very large increase in inflation. So economic structure and policies influence what is the real rate. If monetary policy is consistently implemented through a period of time, if fiscal policy responds to rules and is not procyclical, and also is consistently implemented through long periods of time, then risk perceptions are going to be reduced. The expectations of agents about the adjustment of real exchange rates is going to be different every time there are terms of trade shocks. And so then real rates, the natural real rate is going to be much less volatile, policy rates are going to be much less volatile, and inflation is going to be much less volatile. So let me say a few words about Russia before and after the inflation targeting, because I think this is a success story and it deserves to be repeated. So the first thing is this. First of all, adequate policy making in very difficult context allowed Russia to, in very difficult circumstances, reduce headline and expectations of inflation quite rapidly in the last year and a half or 2 years. The fact that the target was chosen prudently and it was achieved much faster than the experience of other emerging markets. The fact that inflation is already around the target should provide room for the central bank to continue reducing rates this year. One thing that I've been repeating since the presentation began, containing fiscal risk is essential for inflation not to be too volatile in response to terms of trade shocks. And the other thing is, and we're going to show specific charts on this, is risk perceptions are also volatile, but given that monetary policy has been prudent, and on the expectation that monetary policy will continue to be prudent in the future, and the fiscal policy will be prudent in the future, the level of risk perception should be reduced, and the natural real rate should also be reduced. So first of all, transmission from terms of trade to the real exchange rate. Very clear from these charts. If you look at history of Russia last 15 years, oil prices increase, the real exchange rate appreciates. Oil prices decrease, the real exchange rate depreciates. And there is a clear link between this and unit labor costs. That is how competitive the country is. And so just keep in mind that every time that the country becomes non-competitive and there's a shock to the terms of trade, the way to adjust this with floating exchange rate is through inflation. So let me show you then how this adjusted since the shocks hit the country at the end of 2014. Of course, since the country was operating at $100 per barrel of oil, it had to suddenly, over a period of 4 months, to begin operating at an oil price of 50. The way the economy adjusted to that shock with floating exchange rate is to basically depreciation of the exchange rate much higher than the increase in inflation. But the pass-through there is very clear. The pass-through lasted for a period of time, around 12 months. At the beginning, what we had, and you see there, the distribution of different prices inside the CPI. At the beginning, in May 2015, a few months after the shock hit, what you have is that the dispersion of prices was very high, and some prices were increasing almost by 50% year on year. But as this adjustment to terms of trade shock began to be absorbed by the economy, the distribution began to be more focused in the middle. And if you see the last one, May 2017, what we have is that we have a very, almost a point in the middle, a distribution that is extremely non-skewed, and around a level that is 4%. So this means that basically the adjustment to these terms of trade shocks is basically over. Another way to see this is to look at tradable and non-tradable goods within the CPI. And look at, and so you have there in blue, you have tradable goods. These are goods that compete with imports or that the country exports. In red, you have non-tradable goods that are services, and the yellow bar is administered goods, like some tariffs, electricity, gas, etc. And what you see then is, in September 2015, the economy was still in the middle of an adjustment to terms of trade shocks. People thought inflation is high, but this inflation only revealed the fact that there was not a fiscal rule and that the economy was adjusting to these terms of trade shock. But this situation already in 2016, 1 year later, was already almost done. And what you see then is that, first, increases in inflation were much lower, and second, the distribution between tradable and non-tradable goods, much more mixed. So basically also indicating that this adjustment of this adjustment after the terms of trade shock was already over. One, before passing on describing a little bit the international experience and options to the future, one more thing. The core or the source, I mean, the central bank did a very good job in anchoring expectations. But it's very important to realize that this increase in inflation in 2015 and until 2016, the root of the increase in inflation was the fact that the government only finances about 50% of expenditures from non-oil revenues. And so it's essential going forward, if Russia wants to have an inflation that does not fluctuate too much every time that there is terms of trade shocks, is that the government adopts a fiscal rule. This is essential to continue anchoring inflation expectations. So very briefly, fiscal rule that is in discussion right now looks much better than the previous one, is much more reasonable, much more credible. The only thing that we have discussed with authorities in the latest Article 4 is that maybe further thought should be given to instances in which oil prices go below 40 and they stay there for a long period of time. Imagine a situation like that in January 2016, when oil prices were at 25. Imagine the situation staying more than a few months. It's just the situation lasting 1 year. That the government gives more precision about what would happen in that circumstances would even contribute more to anchor inflation expectations and simplify the job of the central bank. Last thing regarding the real rate and risks. Look at foreign ownership of domestic debt. Clearly, this foreign ownership of domestic debt has one component that is clear sentiment, but also look at how increased from the beginning of the shock. This increase clearly has an element that is oil prices. As oil prices stabilize, the country is perceived as less risky, and so demand from foreigners increase, but also has a policy element, meaning that investors are deeming Russia to be less risky. And so central bank should take these elements into consideration when targeting the real rate. The real rate is not static, it's dynamic and depends on policy. Now, to finalize, just to give few thoughts for the future, what are the options that Russia has in terms of IT? First thing that I would say is that what Russia needs to do, at least from our point of view, is just only fine-tune. I mean, the important elements of this inflation targeting are already in place. People realize that the central bank is serious about getting to 4%, that the floating exchange rate is there to stay, that this is the main objective. The central bank is not participating or intervening in the foreign exchange rate market. So these elements are there. And also the central bank is increasingly transparent. Communication is improving. So inflation targeting, as far as one can get from discussions with investors and from basically how the market behaves, is there to stay. But then, I mean, there are some elements that can be further, fine-tuned in the future. And so let me see, just mention a few areas in which maybe the central bank could discuss a bit. First of all, at the target. Targets are different targets for inflation. I mean, some countries have a point target. That is the case of Central Bank of Russia, and this is completely fine. Some other countries, what they do is they have a point target, and they have tolerance bands, and these tolerance bands do not have to be confused with ranges. And some other countries actually target ranges. And so there are pros and cons with each one of these options, and the best choice depends on the particular structure of the country that is being considered, in this case Russia. So nothing wrong with the point target, maybe consideration to some tolerance band because of uncertainty in modeling, uncertainty on shocks, uncertainty still on fiscal policy may be of place, but this is for central bank to decide. Second issue is the horizon. I mean, what horizon should the central bank target to arrive to inflation? And the question, to this question, what Svensson says is that, I mean, having a target that is defined all the time, it's a little bit unrealistic, because it's not the same if the country is hit by a bad harvest that we know is going to have a short effect and then is going to go away, than having a very strong terms of trade shock that is persistent. The influence on inflation is going to be completely different, and the inflation to go back to the target may take 3 months, and in the second case may take 3 years. So what the experienced inflation targeters have done is that they define loosely medium term. A medium term can mean 2-3 years, depending on the shock that has affected the country. Other countries have been more explicit. They talk 2-3 years, they talk 6 to 8 quarters, like Canada. Inflation measure also important. My colleagues here were describing about the fact that Russia has 38% of the inflation, CPI inflation in goods that are food, basically. This makes, of course, inflation much more volatile. But this is not a problem in itself. I mean, what Canada does, for instance, it gets the main inflation measure, that's the objective, but then uses another one, like core inflation as control, just to see and to see what is the impact on a range of prices. So yes, true, 38% is food, but does not prevent the CPI to be actually the target. And then there is another issue that the purists doing inflation targeting refer as very needed, is the publication of interest rates. In this case, it's very clear, and we saw this in the first slide, that inflation projections by the central bank are conditional on a policy interest rate path, and that transparency is important. What Svensson and others think is that in time, most of the inflation targets are going to converge to publishing the path for future interest rates, but this depends on how mature the country is and whether the market is prepared or not. So some do, some don't, but just keep in mind that the purist said that should be done. So to finalize, just to point that this point target plus a tolerance band that needs to be very clearly communicated by the central bank, because a tolerance band is not the same as a range, just to clarify. If I have a range and I am projecting that my range is inflation target, and imagine its range is 4 plus 1 minus 1. If inflation is 5, I achieve the target. If inflation is 3, I achieve the target. It could create complication in anchoring expectations. This is completely different than having a tolerance band. So you have there countries that do point targets and countries that do point target plus tolerance bands. That is the most popular option for emerging markets. And then you have some that do the target range. With that, I finalize. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabriel. Спасибо большое. Вы очень...
Thank you very much. Gabriel, you just picked up on the discussion point precisely. And I'm turning floor over to you, Hakan, in enlightening us upon the Turkish experience in working in changing and uncertain conditions. Maybe we could add one more question in your presentation, that of interaction between other policies. Fiscal policy, the opportunities, macro-prudential supervision policy, and how do you see the interaction between these policies at the working level, where the interaction between staff members and board members and other things? If you could cover it in your presentation. Thank you.
Excellent conference. I'm very happy to be here in this magnificent city and presenting in this very successful conference. My presentation is about Turkey. In fact, the Turkish case is not the most successful case you can see. But I thought still it might be useful, because one tends to learn more from failures and mistakes than successes. So I will try to be as open and frank as possible in order to maximize the benefit of this presentation. let me just start with a brief evolution of inflation targeting in Turkey, because for those of you who are not familiar with the Turkish case, I think it's good to go back and understand the evolution of stages. So I have put these 4 different stages of inflation targeting. All of them are inflation targeting, but they have some different ingredients. We first started in 2001 with a crisis. Actually, we were under an crawling peg exchange rate regime under an IMF program, and it collapsed. And then we had to switch to floating exchange rate regime along with inflation targeting at that time. We didn't call it explicit inflation targeting at the beginning because there were monetary targets also, and the communication procedure did not really look like a conventional inflation targeting framework. So we called it an implicit inflation targeting framework. But interestingly, that was the most successful period where we did the implicit version. And then, encouraged by the success, we decided to go the full way, like a conventional inflation targeting framework, that the cutting-edge conventional inflation targeting framework that the advanced economies adopt. So that was the period between 2006 and 2010. But then after the global financial crisis, the capital flow volatility increased. And given that we have current account deficit and a lot of volatility in exchange rate due to global financial flows and so on, we decided thinking about ways to somehow incorporate financial stability issues into the inflation targeting framework. And then we changed the objectives and tools slightly also to give room for financial stability at that time. But that policy did not deliver low inflation. Inflation became high and very persistent, and inflation expectations were also persistent at this period. And recently, in 2016, we thought that some of the inflation is related to structural issues in Turkey. Some of it is monetary policy, yes, but there are also some structural problems, such as volatility in agricultural prices, or the dollarization and the unhedged borrowing by FX corporates, which complicate the whole process. And so since in the last 1 year, we started putting more focus on structural issues and working closely with the government and other institutions to address some of the structural problems. But at the same time, at the background, we still conduct a monetary policy that is consistent with an inflation targeting framework. But we really work hard to raise awareness regarding structural issues, do conduct research, and do collaboration with relevant institutions in order to address some of the structural problems. So that's the snapshot of inflation targeting in Turkey, actually. We targeted inflation in all episodes, but you see that as time went by, we tried the different flavors in the inflation targeting framework. But at the end of the day, the inflation targeting success is measured where your inflation is relative to targets. So let me show you the performance, actually. So interestingly, the first episode, so each episode that I have shown you is shown by a different color here. So the first part was very successful. So we brought inflation from 70% in 2002 to around 8% in 2005 in 4 consecutive years. And inflation targets and the realization was very close to each other. And then we switched to a full-fledged inflation targeting. You can see that inflation became very persistent. We couldn't manage to bring inflation further down after 2006. This chart is misleading because the vertical axis is 0 to 80. So if I redraw this chart from 2006 on, from 0 to 16 vertical axis, you see that the inflation, which is the blue line, was almost all the time above the targets. So we first started with 4% target, actually, in 2007, 2008. But we had to change the target in 2009. And then we came back to 5% in the last couple of years, but still inflation was always above the targets, hovering around 8% and very volatile. I will show you what happened to inflation expectations. First, I'm going to show you the successful period, and then the unsuccessful period. So this is the successful period. This vertical axis shows the distribution of inflation expectations, the minimum and maximum survey of professional forecasters at the beginning of the year for end year. And these diamonds show the inflation target. You see how inflation expectations came down through time, but more importantly, they became more concentrated around the target. So the distribution has shrunk through time. So it's a great success of this period, actually. But it took time. That is maybe one lesson. I mean, it takes time, so we should not be really, very impatient about bringing and concentrating inflation around the target, because just people respond to track record. And it took almost 3-4 years of overperformance in order to bring really, make the inflation expectations concentrated around the target. But look what happened in the unsuccessful period, after 2007, when inflation targets were being breached on the upside. So inflation expectations started moving again on the upside. And especially look at the last 4 years, where even the minimum of inflation expectations and the distribution is above the targets. So the economic agents just respond to realizations, and the inflation expectations are mostly backward-looking. But how can we anchor inflation expectations? I mean, apart from having a good track record, are there ways to speed up the convergence of inflation expectations? The first thing is to have a clear operational framework. So what we have here in the Turkish case, although it is not very successful, I would still show you because there are some ingredients that are relevant to the Russian case. So we target 5% CPI inflation. Okay? At the beginning, we discussed about targeting and moving average, or moving average of annual inflation, but we didn't do that because when you create a very persistent measure, then even if a temporary shock hits the economy, that stays within the measure for a very long period of time, which makes the communication difficult. So we wanted to go with the end-year CPI inflation, and we defined an uncertainty band also plus minus 2%. We use the uncertainty band for accountability principles. Just at the end of the year, if inflation falls outside the band, we write an open letter to the government, actually. We use a target horizon of 3 years. So at the end of December, for example, we will set the target for 2021 or something like that. And the forecast horizon is consistent with the target. I think it's good to provide longer-term inflation forecasts to anchor expectations. But before that, I would also talk about why do we have a high tolerance band? Because I know that, for example, Russia also has concerns about if we put a tolerance band, then the inflation expectation will move to the upside to the band. I think that depends on implementation. So if the central bank is serious about the midpoint, people understand it. But in our case, it didn't happen because even our policy members and the politicians thought that 7% is okay. So upper bound is okay. So that creates some bias. So it's a very fragile situation. I mean, the central bank has to be really independent in order to do that. And we have a really high, wide tolerance band compared to other countries. First of all, on the left, you can see the impact of fresh fruit and vegetables to the inflation. It fluctuates crazily. So you have to, you need a tolerance band to explain it to the people. And second, the pass-through. On the right-hand side, I have plotted several emerging market economies, 12-month pass-through. And Turkey is on the high side. And I realized that Russia, which is the orange bar, is also on the high side in terms of exchange rate pass-through. I just took an average of some papers, so I know that the pass-through is a time-varying concept, but still, when you compare across countries, Russia is. So this may also, you might need some form of accountability or some tolerance band to tolerate these relative price changes. Otherwise, there is this risk of overreacting to exchange rate developments. And the presentation of inflation forecast. It's very important to anchor inflation expectations. We provide a forecast range. So this blue shaded area shows the inflation forecast. With 70% probability, we say the inflation will fall inside the span. That's a very useful device because when a significant shock hits the economy, like we had at the beginning of this year, we had a huge depreciation and inflation moved to 11%. And then we had to explain, what is the exact horizon that we plan inflation to bring back to the target, because the short-term inflation target becomes useful. Then the forecast becomes the intermediate anchor in that time. So we published this forecast where we bring inflation back to the target in 2.5 years. It's very useful as a communication device. We also published the output gap, which is on the bottom with the red line, but we don't publish interest rates and exchange rates. Would I recommend? Well, it depends. I mean, I wouldn't really take a part on that. But what we have seen is that it is very difficult to communicate the forecast when you don't publish a very important variable behind the forecast. So the exchange rate is the main driver. The interest rates are the main driver of inflation. And if you don't provide detailed information about these variables, it becomes difficult to convince the financial market participants about why your inflation is falling. So there is this problem. What we do is we provide guidance. For example, Bank of Russia, I noticed that you published the neutral real interest rate. So I think that would really help in communicating. But in terms of exchange rate, we just provide some guidance saying that we expect real exchange rate to be constant throughout the period or something like that. Yeah. So anyway, the inflation expectations are a useful device. But the more important issue is monetary fiscal policy coordination. So we are not like a resource-rich country like Russia, but there are some similarities in terms of the fact that we both have powerful governments and we both have a fiscal policy that is influential in the economy. So the fiscal policy matters a lot. You might get the fiscal policy to set the target. I mean, the fiscal and monetary policy can act together to set the target, but that's not enough. It is important to see a genuine willingness to attain price stability by the government, actually. So in our experience, actually, what we have seen is the consistency of fiscal policy with inflation targets is extremely important. I showed you the successful period and unsuccessful period, remember. So in that successful period, actually, the success story in the background was the fiscal policy. And during that period, the fiscal budgetary targets were perfectly aligned with the inflation path. And the market has seen that. And when the market participants realized that, it was much easier to anchor inflation expectations because the financial markets they closely follow what the fiscal policy is doing. And when they see good coordination, it's much easier. And you know what happened? We brought down inflation without any real cost, actually, because if the fiscal impact has huge effect on the risk premium at that time. And finally, let me talk about the inflation expectations, because I know that this is also an issue in Russia. How much weight should be attached to inflation expectations? My own experience says that inflation expectations are extremely important, but there is a risk of overemphasizing inflation expectations because first of all, there are very different measures of inflation expectations, and we don't really know which one is more important than the other in terms of price setting behavior and so on. Especially look at the Turkish case, for example, the consumer inflation expectations, which is at the top, is much higher than the professional forecasters and market-based inflation expectations. It's very sticky. And one reason is probably the consumers just believe in the measurement of inflation, or their perceived inflation is much higher because of food and energy prices. So we should not really, we should realize that inflation expectation is only one of the variables, and the central bank's own forecast may be more informative. I also had slides on capital flows and inflation targeting, but I don't have time to cover them. So if there's a question in the Q&A session, then I can come back to that.
Спасибо, Hakan.
Thank you very much. At the previous session, Antonio Spillenberger gave an example of Turkey. Thank you very much indeed for your contribution. Antonio Spillenberg made a good, detailed example of capital flows in Turkey, so that has been already covered. However, they might result in some further questions during this session. So, and the final presentation is by Sergei. Please, the floor is yours. So, what are the role of the structural elements and how the central bank has to bear them in mind and act upon them, and for just the neutral rate and other things will be also interesting to see your view on that. Please, could you squeeze in 10 minutes so that we could leave some time for questions and answers?
Okay, I will be speaking in English because I spent all of my professional career abroad. Sorry, can I? So first, let me say a few congratulatory words to Central Bank of Russia. It has been a huge success. Effectively, Central Bank reached its target of 4% half a year ahead of schedule. And if not for Mother Nature, which provided us with cold summer, we could have undershoot the target by now. This is quite remarkable given experience of inflation targeters, especially from low-income countries. There is a study by IMF staffer back in 2009, and he looked at low-income IT countries like Brazil, Chile, Poland, Romania, Turkey, which started this inflation period from average of 8% and actually missed their disinflation target by quite a lot, by 2.4 percentage points on average. And this is despite the target being quite wide, band of 1.3% plus or minus percentage points. And it's actually a bull's eye. I mean, if you think about what happened in Russia, it's quite remarkable. And this happened in very open economy, which is where exchange rate is very sensitive to oil price, which is incredibly high to forecast. Right? This is either the best central bankers in the world or the best luck in the world, right? Or maybe some linear combination of the two. And then summarizing experience of inflation targeters, Roger recommends that in future central banks actually increase the range, increase the tolerance band to plus minus 1.5%, simply because target which is missed too often is not a target. Okay, and we actually do not know how often Russia will be missing its target going forward. Now let me talk a little bit about some of the issues which you raised. Right now, there are some voices, especially in US academic monetary economics community, arguing for increasing the target from 2 to 4%. And there is a very recent July 11th IGM forum panel on inflation target, where almost 30% weighted by confidence agreed with the following statement. These are leading US economies, and the statement was the following. If the Fed changed its inflation target from 2% to 4%, long-run costs of inflation for households would be essentially unchanged. 50% disagreed. So 4% target is not majority view, but it's actually strong minority view that if target would be increased to 4%, nothing major would be changed. And then full 70% agreed with the statement that if we raise inflation target to 4%, it would make it possible for Fed to lower rates by a greater amount in future recession. Basically, this is a statement about future hitting of zero lower bound. And then the question is, should Central Bank of Russia start thinking about the next recession? right? Should we start thinking about zero lower bound in Russia? I know it sounds ridiculous at the moment, but in 5 years we actually could be there. And how to prepare ourselves for future zero lower bound, because I do believe that given the Russian demographics and productivity developments in Russia, R* is going to be pretty low here going forward. So it is a clear threat, and introducing a range or tolerance band might be a way to go forward, one of the ways to prepare ourselves for future zero lower bound. And yes, I agree that everything has costs, especially on credibility side. Anchoring of inflation expectations could happen at wrong value. Yes, there was a mention of what should we target. My view is that Russia should stick with CPI, not thinking about switching to core CPI, for example, simply because of lower level of financial literacy. It is much easier to communicate CPI headline inflation. And then, if we are talking about inflation forecast targeting, we need to think about what is medium run. In my opinion, I'm academic economist, I'm not central banker, so in my view, medium run is 2 years. But is it too long for Russia? Everything I know about planning horizons in private sector tells me that they tend to be shorter than 2 years. With very short planning horizons in private sector, who is going to believe anything that's going to happen 2 years down the road? Does it matter for them? And if medium run is too long in Russia, is it going to subtract or from or to add to the stock of credibility which the central bank has achieved over the last two years? And I wanted to speak a little bit more about inflation expectations compared following up on the last speaker. So here you have, this is taken from World Bank's last country report for Russia. And you see a huge discrepancy between CPI, behavior of CPI, which is this violet line, and inflation expectations, which is a blue line. Basically, inflation expectations are very sluggish. They are forward-looking. They clearly started to decrease only after year-on-year inflation started to drop precipitously from about 15 to about 7%. But then, even after full 2 years of disinflation, and after we have achieved the target, expectations are still very far behind actual inflation. We have delta in inflation around 11 points, and delta in expectations is just about 5 points. So it's crucial to understand why this is so, because inflation expectations play a crucial role in New Keynesian Phillips curve, of course. Now, I was trying to avoid equations, but being academic, I could not. So if we just write the most basic NKPC, where inflation depends on some constant, expectations of inflation, and a term where we put everything else. And this alpha t could have been fixed at very high level for high inflation, and then at a certain point it is reduced to some alpha hat, which is lower. Classical result in this model is that inflation expectations and inflation drop immediately, and they converge on a new target level. If we have this gradually declining inflation target, like we saw in Turkish case, then under rational expectations, inflation should be dropping very fast and then slowly asymptotically converge to the new level. Now this, if you remember the graph from World Bank, it might be the case, it might be what happened in Russia, right? Very fast drop in inflation initially and then asymptotic convergence, but inflation expectations do not tell this story. Either agents did not believe into this disinflation path, either this disinflation path was uncredible, or agents perceived that there was a systematically negative sequence of shocks. But it's actually hard to reconcile inflation expectations and inflation under rational expectations. Now, adaptive learning, I'm adaptive learning guy, so I cannot stand not talking about adaptive learning here. In the simplest form, this AT is agents' expectations about mean inflation, and in the simplest formulation, they adjust the inflation expectation by using forecast error, pi t minus AT minus 1, the expectation of current inflation formed in the past period, times gamma. And gamma is learning gain, which is basically a measure of how fast agents are incorporating new information into their beliefs. And this parameter could be particularly low in Russia, given past experience, given the very long period of very high inflation rates. If this is the case, if this is what happens, literature on adaptive learning suggests that central bank could be behaving aggressively, meaning that Taylor rule should have very high coefficient on inflation, in order to speed up convergence of inflation expectations to whatever target there is. However, this result is true only in stationary environment. There is very active research right now about what happens during disinflation phase. Luckily, we are out of disinflation phase now, so this might be policy recommendation that central bank might be thinking about very aggressive policy, Taylor rule. Another theoretical construct for this sluggish inflation expectation is inattentive consumers. There is this theory of Carroll called epidemiology of inflation expectations, where agents are basically do not pay attention to inflation news. Occasionally they read newspaper or they go to professional forecaster, buy forecast, and then they update their forecast. There is a lot of evidence that ordinary people indeed do not pay attention to news about inflation. There is this paper by Damien Fajar and Santoro in 2013. However, when they actually do pay attention, they do not adjust towards professional forecasters' inflation expectations. Okay, so if you look at household inflation expectations, it's very hard to make any sense out of them. Indeed. But then if this is correct, if this view of household inflation expectations is accepted, then usage of this variable in monetary policymaking should be questioned very severely, right? And so summary, disinflation has been a success, inflation expectations are very high, it is unlikely that they were rational, therefore we have to figure out what kind of irrationality there is. If they are adaptive, central bank might consider adopting aggressive Taylor rule, which should be actually aggressive both on upside and downside. If it is inattentive consumers, then at least household inflation expectations should be severely downweighted in monetary policy. And being academic scientist, I really must conclude there is disclaimer that more research is needed on inflation expectation formation mechanism. Okay, thank you.
Спасибо, Сергей, большое. Ну, у вас тоже предстоит следующий этап.
Thank you very much, Sergey. There's a new stage waiting for you, the new stage of policy and a new stage of research. So, dear colleagues, thank you very much for your speeches. I managed to incorporate my questions, and in the majority of cases I received answers to them, and we are just on time, finishing on time. And if you allow me, I would like to give an opportunity to the audience to ask questions if they have any questions. So please. And the question to Alexander. The question to Hakan and to other participants. What Hakan didn't manage to tell about the influence of capital flows on the monetary policy, inventory policy. The question in the context of what is discussed in contemporary world, because the dilemma of monetary policy of Helen Ray, to what extent do such countries as Turkey, Russia, because we're interested in Russia as well, is it, Helen Ray says that it is impossible to carry out independent monetary policy, which has an impact on reaching inflation goals, and in this regard, what should be done? First and foremost, Helen Ray is talking about prudential measures as most efficient instrument, but she does not exclude the measures of control over the capital flows. So what do you think of that?
Thank you for the opportunity to answer. In the morning, actually, we had another session. There was the previous IMF representative talking about the Turkish case, and he related this unsuccessfulness of inflation targeting framework to using multiple tools, multiple objectives. But I don't agree in one sense. The reason that why our inflation targets were missed was actually, we were, as the central bank, we didn't react enough to the inflationary shocks. But the monetary policy was not tight enough. That was the main reason, actually. So at the end of the day. Regarding the use of macroprudential instruments and the non-conventional tools, I think we had some serious impact. The whole idea was to reduce the trade-offs, because those capital flow volatility creates a trade-off, because when an exchange rate depreciates, for example, the confidence falls, economic activity declines, but the inflation rises, and central bank has to raise interest rates at a time when the economic activity is already falling. So this is a typical dilemma. Right? So in order to resolve this dilemma, I think a good coordination between macroprudential policy, fiscal policy, and the central bank policies is very crucial. For example, last year, we had a similar episode. We had unfortunate domestic events, political events in Turkey, so the economic activity collapsed significantly at that time. So as the central bank, now we have a very high interest rate. But we released the macroprudential tightening, so we eased the macroprudential policy significantly and created a mechanism through the fiscal policy to ease, to support the credit supply to SMEs at that time. So these are all coordinated policies. So we managed to stabilize inflation since last year, but the economic activity also recovered. So we didn't go into this spiral of, having less credit supply, economic activity slowing down, and this is creating a vicious circle. But you need, the bottom line is that you need definitely a second instrument. That instrument, what will be that instrument? I think that depends completely on the country's structural characteristic, institutional structure, and so on. But definitely, a second tool is necessary. That's my
Спасибо.
Thank you very much. Other questions, if there are any? So, any other questions? If no, I would like to ask a question to Oscar.
Здесь вот в аудитории есть представители и руководители региональных.
Representatives of regional divisions of the Bank of Russia in the audience. So the question to you, Oscar, is what would you recommend to pay priority attention in Russia? So Russia is a big country with varying regions in the geographical accessibility and economic development. What would be your recommendations in terms of the priority attention, probably this coordination of the policies, which might entail some imbalance on the market and some bubbles appearance.
Yes, well, I mean, according to our experience in the euro area and in countries like Spain and others, the fact that you have a single monetary policy for the whole euro area, which in this dimension may the problem could be similar for a big country like Russia, implies that most of the time monetary policy is not optimal for most of the regions. I mean, for instance, in the case of Spain is very telling in this respect. From 1999 to 2007, monetary policy conducted by the ECB was relatively expansionary. I mean, when we look at the Taylor rule for Spain, I mean, as a way to measure the degree of monetary stance given the situation of the Spanish economy, we would typically see that monetary stance at the level of the euro area was too expansionary for the Spanish economy. For instance, given that, as I said before, inflation was systematically higher in the Spanish economy than in the rest of the euro area, what we would find those years is that the real interest rate, the ex-ante real interest rate, for most part of the first decade of this century, was significantly negative. So an important, maybe obvious exposed point is that in a large economy, monetary policy is unlikely to be optimal for most of the time. So you may have regions for which a given monetary policy is too expansionary, whereas at the same time you may have regions where it would demand more monetary stimulus. One of the big lessons, according to the European experience, is that ideally you would like to provide more efficiency and resilience to the member economies, and in this respect, structural reforms are key. I mean, in the case of Spain, we had a very dysfunctional labor market before the crisis with very little labor mobility. In some sectors, competition was clearly not enough, and as time goes by, we accumulated an important loss of competitiveness. In good times, you don't see the effects of this loss of competitiveness because everything runs very smoothly, there is plenty of credit, the economy is growing, and so on and so forth. But when the crisis came, I mean, you realize that this is a very problematic situation. So an important lesson for us is that you have to insist on implementing structural reforms that make the economy more efficient and more resilient. And the other lesson that I also mentioned in my presentation has to do with fiscal policy. I mean, again, Spain is unfortunately a very useful example in this respect. In 2007, just before the crisis, the government was running a fiscal surplus, which was the first time in recent history that we were able to run a fiscal surplus. Anyway, I mean, the level of debt in 2 years' time jumped from 30-something% of GDP, I'm talking about public debt, to something around 100% of GDP. So ex post, it was obvious that the surplus in 2007 was too low. I mean, monetary policy, even if it showing a surplus, was not sufficient counter-cyclical. This is an important lesson again. I mean, you have to think of having some fiscal backstops for the rainy days. And again, it is very difficult to convince the governments to run fiscal surplus when the economy is growing very fast, because it's politically it's very costly to save money. But this is an important lesson from the European experience.
Спасибо большое. Ну что ж, еще раз спасибо большое.
Thank you very much. Thank you, dear colleagues, for your active participation. We are finished.